Welcome everyone to, I believe this is the fourth installment of the OSMED Member Highlight. What we do is that we select exceptional people, and there are many at the OSMED organization who are doing really incredible things in all three disciplines that we cover. For those who don't know, OSMED is the Organization for Space Medicine, Engineering, and Design. And our mission is to advance human space exploration by facilitating interdisciplinary cooperation, communication, and access to knowledge for the global community. So the three disciplines that we cover, which are in the name OSMED, are space medicine, engineering, and design. And today we're going to dedicate our episode to design. And as a special guest today, we have Farhan Asif. So welcome, Farhan.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. So what we do is that we rotate one designer, one engineer, one space medicine practitioner um, each month, and we want to make sure that people know who is part of OSMED, who is playing an important role in making sure that we create this safer and more inclusive future for the space flight. And all of us, space nerds who really care about humans, first and foremost, have um, many things to say based on the work that we've done, on the projects that we've been involved with, and sometimes there are gaps, right? And perhaps there's a project that needs a designer, or perhaps there's a design project that needs a flight surgeon, or someone who knows a lot about human physiology. And this is the place for you to connect, to learn, and to be curious about all the subjects that can make this future of human spaceflight so much nicer for everyone. Um, just so everybody know, this episode will be recorded, and Michael, who here appears as James, because his as this one is his other name, is actually going to upload these episodes on YouTube. And James Michael, if you want to share the link to the YouTube channel in the chat, that'd be wonderful. So I'm going to ask everyone to collect questions that might come up to you as we're having a conversation with Farhan in the chat box. You can either use the chat box on Google Meet, or you can use the Q&A feature if you know how to use that. But at the end of this episode, the last 15 minutes will be dedicated to the Q&A session. But today we're going to start with brief introductions, followed by a 15-minute presentation that Farhan was very gracious to put together for us, because as designers, we like the visuals. And then after that, there's going to be a conversation between him and I about how he got into space and a lot of subjects that you might be interested in. And now keep an eye on the questions, and maybe that really influence the type of questions I ask Farhan throughout the interview. Without any further ado, we will start this event. So thank you so much. Don't forget to put questions in the chat. So, Farhan, it's a pleasure to have you here. Farhan is a interdisciplinary designer, and he'll explain to us a little bit what that means. He and I have this thing in common where we've touched so many aspects of design. The word design is such a weighted word that is quite difficult to define for most people, and sometimes difficult for designers to define for themselves. But very the fact that he's touching on so many aspects of design is really brilliant. And he actually studied industrial design, like I did actually. And industrial design, for those who don't know, is the practice of designing physical products, um, for the most part, for mass manufacturing. So think of everything that you see around you: a table, a chair, a car, a pair of sneakers. Um, all of these things are actually designed by industrial designers. And so we'll learn a little bit about that when Farhan talks a bit more about the work that he does. But Farhan, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Phnam, for the introduction. Please let me know if you can hear me properly. If my microphone is working well.
We can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Um, and let me know if you see my screen.
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining the talk today. Conversation on design, and as Phanam rightly opened up, the design that we do, both Phanam and I have touched on a lot of different areas of design. And I have had this sort of an evolution of defining what design is, and this is like a great opportunity to kind of do that. So the way I define design is to design is to realize desired futures, and by that I mean shaping meaningful change through empathy and collaboration, which is grounded in iterative and research-driven approach. In other words, we're trying to reevaluate a common misconception about design. Design isn't just aesthetics or an afterthought. It is that, but so much more when it comes to innovation. It is how we translate complexity around us into human terms, so solutions actually work for those that are impacted and get adopted. Make us do more with being human, both in everyday lives and at the frontiers of exploration, as all of us have common interests here. Um, So, a little bit about where my practice lands. So, I have worked on projects across health and well-being, education and learning projects, and social impacts. So, um, but coming from an industrial and product design background, it's difficult to put myself into a silo and say that, oh, I design speakers or furniture. Albeit you will see that that's kind of how I started into design as well. As I kind of get into the details of that. Yeah, so some of the projects that I've worked on basically involve designing medical technologies, including point of care tools and wearable devices, exhibits for public learning and patient education, digital learning for care providers and elementary school teachers. Um, and yeah, so I've kind of split my talk into kind of five parts, and hopefully you can get through all of this. So I would like to start with the first one that is I call the day zero sign, from afterthought to advantage. Um, this conversation is important, considering that bringing designers and the concepts and requirements, bringing designers in at the concepts and requirements is important to formulate a path towards better outcomes and solutions. Integrating empathy into the engineering from the get go. Asking those questions about how the people that we're designing for, or creating those solutions for, are impacted by it. And hopefully, this can initiate conversations on how design at an early stage can contribute de-risking, supporting business goals, all while making sure solutions work for those who end up using them. Um, so I thought since we're all space nerds here and are have shared that common interest, maybe having that example would be helpful. So here's an example of an Apollo 13 event that some of us might be aware of. Um, is basically, as you see on the screen, is a CO2 fix that I see as a design archetype where constraints, collaboration, and creativity under pressure come together to kind of solve a life threatening problem. So it was the device that you see is an improvised lithium hydroxide device for the lunar module's ventilation system, which allowed the crew to breathe and survive when there was too much CO2 in the module. And this is a classic constraints-driven solution built from onboard materials. Um, and something that I would like to kind of introduce here is, so design basically aims to make that kind of creative problem solving happen before it's a crisis. So designers structure such methods and collaboration from day zero through translation, rapid prototyping, and constraint-based testing, and asking questions from a user experience perspective, like what could go wrong and how do we tackle those problems before it's a crisis. Um, So you see these issues not just at the frontiers, but in everyday life. You see these on Earth, and when design becomes an afterthought, the failures around us. Um, some of the examples are on your screen here, specifically some of them dealing with how I've experienced during my work with medical interfaces and everyday electronics. Albeit some might consider they look pretty. For example, that microwave on there, designed by Bosch, and this is what happens when sort of design becomes an afterthought and you're trying to um, basically, bolt on as opposed to build in the usability, into the solutions. So kind of going into the second part, the thinking about the practice. I like to kind of transition into explaining how going from designing things to designing systems, how designs evolve, how my practice has evolved, and how we can start thinking of design in a different way. So it's natural that most people associate design with aesthetics, appearance, or consumer products, which is fair. This is historically that is accurate. That's how design came to its inception. Um, but the discipline has evolved over the decades, and that evolution explains why design is now showing up in healthcare, in education, and policy. So let's trace a little bit that evolution and briefly understand why design today is as much about systems as it is about surfaces and finishes. Um, so getting into from going from products to systems of meaning and what I mean by that. So traditional application of design was popularized through mass-produced objects and products, one-off consumer products, sometimes, and visual mediums and so on. It is then relevant, discussing how this has evolved over the decades. It used to be about craft and form, making the physical world more functional and beautiful. But it went to the what we call design 2.0 and considering the experiences with those outputs. Because now you're starting to think of like how that impacts people that are interacting with your designs. So and then Oh, that's a typo in my slide there. That's supposed to be design 3.0. Which talks about the transformation, and thinking of design as uh, taking into account the systemic impact of the solutions that come out of it. So you can think of your everyday solutions where it if you're using a medical device, it's fairly common these days to have an app that goes with the device that gives you more insights. So, for example, your wearable devices, and those insights then translate into how you conduct various health treatments in your life and so on. So there's like far-reaching consequences that we start to understand, and how design actually evolves to tackle some of those aspects as well. Today design is more about it's also about systemic change. It considers people's needs, but also the processes and undone and unforeseen unseen infrastructure connecting them. And so my practice starts here somewhere where design is expected, as I call it. Early focus was on tangible outcomes, refining form, exploring materials, manufacturing techniques, and creating experiences, which actually led to eventually using these skills and these tools in my toolbox to then actually tackle some more larger problems and complex issues that we all face in our everyday lives. And so this was the pivot to purpose, as I call it, just discovering design's potential for the positive impact through projects that range from creating learning experience for teachers that teach kids math to development of kids with developmental disabilities, fostering inclusive communities to creating toolkits for housing people with disabilities and able-bodied residents, working with neonatologists at neonatal intensive care unit to create an observation tool to observe behavioral cues in preterm infants, and public installations to explain complex technology like AI, and through exhibition and interactive artifacts. It's important to understand here, as I mentioned before, the design's expanding scope, going from design as an artifact, like thinking of design in terms of an artifact. This can be the tangible solution shaped by form, function, and technical requirements, and the manufacturability, um, which we all have come to understand and appreciate about some of the good designs that we share in our lives. Um, and then it comes to the interface and experience with those artifacts. So this can be the medium between the artifact technology and the user that's using them. Thinking about the behavior, the usability, the errors and risks that come out of being in interaction with that platform. And then finally, you have the systems or ecosystems where the relationship between the user, the technology, and their environment are or a structure or structures that shape the experience actually contribute to the entire designed process. And this leads us into the approach of how design applies these things throughout the design process. So methods that make ideas tangible. In complex systems, like in healthcare, it's tempting to overthink before acting and making that change, bringing about innovation that's really needed. Design works differently in these cases, so we build early, we test fast, and let evidence and empathy guide the next step. And sometimes this can vary in fidelities. So one of the things that you might have come across before is designers learn by doing. A lot of our work involves actually making those things, making rough, low fidelity prototypes, and then eventually expanding on those as you're answering those questions of how what problem you're trying to solve along the way to then keep refining on that. Um, so, uh, one example you can think of here in healthcare is basically prototyping with constraints of technical specifications and usability, which can help answer important questions early and de-risk and evaluate strategies of how you move forward with medical devices, for example, or other digital tools. Each trial takes into account various requirements and needs, including technical, business, and end user needs. And I'll give a brief example here. So going beyond the technical requirements, there are things that we consider, which are the human factors. So, for example, in this case, it's a device that's a concept for as an alternative to EpiPens, as you might know, um, using a non-invasive method to deliver epinephrine and translating a novel research into a device like this not just involves thinking of the technology, which is often the case, but also thinking of the human factor side of things, the how people that are going to be using it actually interact with it. For example, thinking of the form factors and thinking of in terms of creating these prototypes in various fidelities. These testings might focus on how the form supports the usability of the how do you use the device, considering how self-administering versus by a caregiver might be different in this case. When you're experiencing anaphylaxis, creating clear cues of how to use the device while also thinking of how to prevent accidents and risks. And as you can see, some of the images, like this is a few chosen images that just kind of show how you can basically test these things as you go through rough low fidelity prototypes to answer those questions early before it becomes of a cost issue or a risk later when it goes live. Um, Prototyping isn't just a way to test ideas, it's a way we think, as designers. So by externalizing ideas early, we align faster, reveal hidden constraints, and move, from speculation to evidence. But good design doesn't happen in ideal conditions, and, my experience working with, the critical care unit, has helped me understand this. Um so what we try to do is we if we can't recreate the exact context, we build constraint equivalence equivalent simulations that mirror the cognitive, physical, and emotional pressures of the real use. Um, one thing you can think of is we've heard of human factors. So, it's the study of human abilities and limits to make safer and more efficient solutions. However, human-centered design then applies those principles, those understandings through to that science into iteration with users. So, for example, was a project where I worked, as I mentioned, in the neonatal intensive care unit with some neonatologists that were wanting to create an observation tool to observe behavioral cues in preterm infants to create individualized care plans. And it was a fairly complex process where they do these observations over hours, and every baby has a different developmental stage that they're at. And so, how do you make a tool that actually works for them? And most of these doctors that we worked with identified as self-identified technologically challenged. So we're thinking of how do we communicate how we're designing that solution as well as we go. So good design succeeds when it respects those human limitations and reducing risks and asking those questions um, by doing those observations and creating those low fidelity prototypes um, moving forward. Another example that I can talk about here is sometimes the quick and dirty iterations can actually lead to redefining the problem that you're trying to solve. So, in 2020, the government of Canada actually projected an estimated 63,000 tons of COVID-19 related PPE ending up in landfills, and they put up a challenge to come up with solutions for this. And me and my team were exploring this issue. We came at it from exploring the sustainability of PPE, looking at PPE alternatives, sustainable alternatives, and eventually we had to pivot. So as we started to explore why there weren't any sustainable solutions, we realized the problem wasn't that there weren't sustainable solutions. The problem was that the system prevented those innovations to come into the system. So this is where you see an example of how designers reformulate the problem statement and actually start working on a different one. So going from exploring sustainable PP alternatives to creating a co-design tool that helps those stakeholders that are impacted by this. So that can be healthcare providers, that can be policymakers, manufacturers, researchers that are developing these solutions to actually visualize that systemic complexity. And so this actually came about as doing those, again, low fidelity, rough, messy prototypes where we're actually doing workshops with end users to see like how they see the waste of PPE, and we realized that the problem wasn't that. And then we interviewed researchers, and we found that the problem wasn't that the solutions didn't exist. They existed in silos in labs, but they weren't able to actually bring it into market. Whereas the end users, the care providers, actually didn't see the impact of the waste. Um, and so we pivoted to creating that co-design tool that helped you visualize, help these stakeholders sit at a table and visualize what the barriers were, and who are the different stakeholders in the system. Um, and so now I come into my fourth section, which is design as translation, bridging disciplines to make systems work. In interdisciplinary settings, especially when you're trying to solve complex challenges, collaboration is extremely important. And that's where you are able to make a meaningful impact where different disciplines collide and actually come up with novel solutions. So, in this scenario, when it's the interdisciplinary settings, design often becomes a translation piece, helping engineers, clinicians, and policymakers align around a shared understanding of people's needs and impact of the potential change that they're about to bring. Um, some of you might have come across this before, and if not, I will kind of briefly explain this. So, how design complements existing workflows through this kind of tying those gaps in um, between technology, policy, and human experience. Um, this is the diagram that explained the innovation sweet spot when we actually take those things into consideration, and this is where design actually offers value in my own experience working with startups, medtech startups, and others, where designers are actually considering those four different areas. So each discipline brings a vital piece. So engineers bring the functionality, clinicians bring the expertise, policy brings structure. However, design connects them, ensuring solutions are actually remain usable and desirable and viable. So if that doesn't happen, you will either fail to attract customers, or go bankrupt, uh, or fail to deliver. Or the experience pushback from regulatory bodies, media, or the public. And of course, yeah, this is going to be a problem, especially if it's a startup. In my experience, um, so I'll do this. I'll explain this with an example that I've recently worked on. I'm glad I got some permission to share some of these examples here, despite part of it being under NDA. So this was a company that I worked for called Loop, where we were developing a, a wearable device for managing systems of polycystic ovarian syndrome in for women's health. So polycystic ovarian syndrome actually affects 1 in 5 women, and it's an underserved market in women's health area. And Neurora approached me as a designer to revisit their existing prototype and actually do a complete design overhaul. Uh, and basically start to reimagine how they can differentiate from the existing market. Um, and the challenge here was basically thinking of the project strategy, from a basic symptom management platform of how PCOS symptoms can be managed, to how that can be a holistic system where you have a neurostimulation device that you can see on the screen, but also an app that supports those insights. Um, and this is where the alignment with business needs, market fits, technical specification, FDA regulations, and then user advisory board comes in. So my role involved not just speaking with the end user advisory board and getting their insights that formulated the design decisions, but also looking at the FDA regulations. So in this case, this was a class 2 medical device. And so there are specific regulations from the FDA regarding that. And then the engineers had their technical specifications of how they wanted the technology to actually work. And then obviously there's the business needs and thinking of the market alignment and fit, and differentiating from what's out there. Um, and so here I would like to talk my experience working with engineers and clinicians, was the translation piece as I talk about. So often you would think of you would I would see the engineers basically come from a technology standpoint. You would think of the science and how science can be packaged to then deliver a solution. However, as a designer, I focus on the bottom up approach where you're thinking of the people that are impacted and then going upwards and kind of meeting in the middle where you're trying to develop that solution with a holistic consideration. Um, and this results in a system that is not just a physical artifact, but also a system that lets the patients actually track their symptoms, generates reports that they take to their doctors for diagnosis, and so on. Um, and finally, I would like to transition into designing for the next frontier, and how I ask these similar questions for what it's to um, questions about extreme environments. So as commercial space flight expands, um, we need to consider the design that not only astronauts, traditional astronauts, but all everyday participants like you and me, um, might be having a chance to go up there someday. And it's a new design space with limited resources, extreme constraints, and deeply human needs. Um, and so this brings into question, what does designing for psychological safety and well-being in isolation look like? How might information design support autonomous care when comms are delayed? Um, how can physical and digital cues help astronauts intuit system states under stress? And this is where I say, let's consider these questions before it's a crisis that leads to mission failure, loss of lives for fellow humans. Thank you for listening to this. I'm open for questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Farhan, for this very rich presentation. Even as a designer who's been practicing for a long time, I was like, oh, this is a very clever way of organizing all of these systems that are part of our practice. And we got to learn a lot about what you care about as a human being and how you apply that to all the different industries that you're innovating in. What I love about the work that you do is, very much like you defined earlier, design is much more than making things pretty. It's really thinking about who we're designing for, why, and um, how best to execute all of this. So in the end, you're not only creating a technology that is, fantastic to exist or great for intellectual property, but also something that changes people's lives for the better. And that last transition in the extreme environment of space and all these questions that seem to be so obvious to us when we live on Earth uh, become fundamental to survival and the idea of thriving in space, which is something that is very, very core to what OSMED cares about. Um, if you had any questions, in relations to everything that Farhan just shared, please share your question on the chat box. And if at the end of this whole event, in the last 15 minutes, we'll give you the floor to ask your questions directly. But let's jump into a little bit of a Q&A between me and Farhan while all this is happening. So we learned a lot about what you're doing today and the types of projects that we that you're working on, that you've been working on in different disciplines. Um, I'd like to know how you came to become a designer. Like, what was the force that drove you, either as a child, a teenager, or a young person, to say, "Hey, I want to be a designer," and why?
Um, I guess that I'm an interesting case of someone that transitioned from engineering into a design discipline. So I started with pre-engineering and then eventually found design through reading books like everyone that is adjacent to design might know is The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. And this was like a spark that kind of led me down a path to pursue design education where I'm like, okay, like design is so much more than what I see around myself. It's in everything. And who does that design? How does that work? And then when I got into design, um basically, I saw design as those silos that traditionally you would think of as like, furniture designer or a shoe designer or a fashion designer and so on. And those, as much as they are still relevant today, we have come to understand that each of these silos themselves actually are a lot more broadly interconnected than we might give them credit to. And my experience with this actually came about through that PPE project where I started to see that it's not always the assumptions that can lead the solution, but also thinking about how you can revisit how you're seeing a problem and then start to um, basically bring in people that are affected by that problem onto the same table to develop those solutions and the right problem, like defining the problem in the right way, and then working with some clinicians where I actually learned that I was born preterm as well, which had a significant impact on thinking about health and well-being. But yeah.
So you mentioned assumptions, which is always a starting point for designers. We have to assume certain things are true in order to go from point A to point B and eventually a solution. That sometimes those assumptions are right and sometimes they're wrong. Could you walk us a little bit through the process of how you figure that out?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of an example that would be best to use in this case.
Like experience using intuition on top of the rigorous processes that we learn in school and in our practices helps a lot. So could you develop a little bit more about how designers use intuition in their work?
I guess kind of around that point. maybe I would like to talk about how designers actually balance those two. So the rigor
Mhm.
and intuition. Traditionally, design has been perceived as something that is more intuitive, abstract, which is still true in some scenarios where you come to the front end of products. However, there is always that rigor in the back end where you're thinking of rigorous testing of things and working through there. So I think it's a balance of both. Often other disciplines focus on that rigor but miss that intuition piece. However, intuition is something that is very human, and that's what designers bring to the equation. Because at the end of the day, we are creating for all of us, and we are all going to be impacted by it whether it's today or tomorrow. And that's another thing to understand is some of these solutions can actually have far-reaching consequences, not just today, but tomorrow, not just on us, but the future generations as well.
Absolutely. One thing that's very apparent in the way you talk about design and you talk about the work that you've done is your ability to use storytelling tools to make the complex into something that's attainable and to turn problems into solutions. Could you tell us a little bit about how a designer can hone and develop the skill of storytelling and how it's been useful in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of go back to that project that I mentioned earlier because we've all kind of looked at those slides, um, where I was working on a concept for an alternative to the EpiPen. A non-invasive drug delivery device. And the idea for that actually comes about as kind of like in parallel, where I come across a research paper that is coming up with this novel way of delivering epinephrine, but at the same time having people in my life that are actually impacted by those health issues. So a friend of mine that had anaphylactic shock, and just being able to see what the experience was and actually using that to inform why is it the way it is? And then eventually when I start to formulate a concept around it, that story becomes really important. That person's experience that I saw, my friend, my colleague, their experience actually became a critical part of how I approached those design parameters as well. Like for example, the person that I had interviewed throughout the project was actually they explained their experience with having this issue since childhood and having to carry a massive EpiPen in their bag, and they were like, well, as a kid I didn't want to carry it around with me. Or when they grew up they were like, it's just too cumbersome, like I don't like carrying with me, or it doesn't work sometimes, and so on. So yeah, that the experiences of people actually becomes a story that defines how I approach the design parameters.
Awesome. The practice of designing is a whole spectrum of skills. A lot of it is hard skills, the skill of taking an idea and turning it into a design, whether it's a physical design, a digital design, or any other form of design or experience. It's also the soft skills based on what we just talked about, the storytelling skills, and making sure that whatever ideas in your mind can be can go forward in the process of development. And what I'd like to know is, how what kind of skills are useful um, to to work with people who practice space medicine or space engineering, right? Like, what are the overlaps that will make it much easier for these people who might not have worked with designers before to start working with designers?
I think the first step is that translation piece that I kind of touched on in the last part of the presentation. Is basically visual being able to like have the skill set that helps you visualize the complexity you're working with, can actually help you see the problem in different ways and see it from different perspectives. So not just that designers can offer a different perspective, but also um, have the skills to actually present that in ways that everyone, all the other disciplines can actually see it and be like, oh, like here's how we can look at it. Here's like when we're thinking of problems in our head or trying to create a mind map and stuff, it gets very complicated. And one of the examples that I shared earlier as well. but using that and then using a designer's skills to actually put it in front of you and make you look at it in a different way. I think that's like a really important piece that's fundamental to starting that collaboration, I think.
Great. So you're pretty young in your career, even though you've like done a lot of like very impressive work. I would like to know if you've already experienced in the space industry, for example, some people who just didn't understand design or didn't particularly respect it, and if you did, how did you handle that situation?
I actually haven't had that experience yet. And I guess the most recent project that I've been working on, and it has more to do with the business side of things, is helping a client actually develop a replica of their satellite to be displayed for an investor summit, and that has to do with how they get those funding avenues. So I haven't had that. Uh, haven't faced that issue yet. Thankfully, maybe, but I think it's important to notice that too. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah, hopefully it happens as late as possible. But it's something that, we need to be aware of as practitioners of a discipline that is often misunderstood. Um, and, uh, and one way it's been misunderstood is when we have conversation with people and they think that design is already covered by engineering, right? That engineers are actually there to design and to solve all these uh, technology problems or human problems that are part of the design of either a space station, a life support system, or whatever you're designing in space. But designers, as you make the point very clearly in your presentation earlier, is really about solving these like human centered problems and asking the right questions at the right time and translating these insights that came out of these interviews into things that people are not only um, understanding how they work, but also are willing to use, right? You can have the greatest technology in the world, but if the person you design it for does not want to use it or does not know how to use it, that is a design problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think to that point, uh, this is an understanding that yes, like engineers can solve the same problems, but I mean, from experience, I've seen where engineers have come up to me and actually expressed that they've seen the value of design after we collaborated, which is I'm glad that's been the experience thus far. But at the same time, I think there is that intention of considering the human needs. However, the methodologies and the rigor that design has to offer to loop in those user needs early on is something that is valuable, I think. Often you see the engineering approach where you would bring the users at the testing phase and not throughout the development leading up to that testing phase. But designers are actually trained to plug in those insights way earlier, so that you're preventing those costly mistakes.
Amazing. Before we jump into questions, and I'm seeing some in the chat, thank you for writing them down. Farhan, you've been a member of OSMED for probably a few months by now, if not a year. Um, what do you see the future of OSMED bring to designers, and what do you see designers bringing to the future of OSMED?
That's a great question. I'm actually working on figuring that out myself. I think it's an exciting organization with a lot of potential. Um, Bringing these three disciplines to one table to solve the problems of the future of spaceflight, um, or to have avenues to discuss those. And as we do that, I think that communication of how that these three disciplines interact um, is something that can be supported by design. And I hope to contribute to that in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. And you've been wonderful at contributing it. So thank you for that. All right, let's jump into questions. Since we're not that many people, I'm going to ask each person who put down a question to come on screen, unmute themselves, and ask the question directly to Farhan. So we're going to start with Elizabeth Forbes Wallace. If you can come on screen for us.
I really don't want to come on screen today, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Um, I didn't have a designer at my house this morning. Anyway, how do you plan to experience if I don't know what you're going to be designing for space, but I mean all the habitats will be different, whether you're commuting in a space, just to low Earth orbit or to suborbital space or whatever, or beyond. It's a different vehicle every time and different seats and different suits and all that. Will you try to experience multiple G force in a centrifuge, low G force in a vomit comet, going on an analog mission, any of those things so that you're depending on your experience of it yourself, not just what other people report. I've done the centrifuge and but that's for another day.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I actually would love to experience all of those things, and actually learn from it. Um, uh, At the moment, I'm still trying to formulate where I end up in terms of contributing to designing for space. But the questions that I'm interested in is have to do with the problem of isolation and the questions of well-being, um, and approaching it from a comfort perspective. So one of the designers that I actually didn't mention here in the presentation, but I thought was interesting, when I actually started kind of exploring OSMED and even before, was Raymond Lowy, who was hired by NASA in the 60s and 70s to design the space, I think the space lab it was called. But at the same time, those designs were seen as outrageous by some of the engineers at the time because like the focus was on the practicality and what can be made. But we've come very far in terms of what's possible with through technology. So I think revisiting some of those questions of comforts and well being as commercial spaceflight takes off, I would like to contribute to that. And if I can experience some of those scenarios and analog missions, I would highly um, enjoy that.
Great. Come back and talk about it.
And as a designer, if you're designing something and 100% of engineers agree with you, you're not working hard enough. We're here to push boundaries and make, ruffle a few hair and making sure that we're, pushing the needle in the right direction as we're developing new ideas. Catherine, I see that you raised your hand. Is it to ask a question or is it to make a comment on what you said?
Oh, it's to ask a question. I think Tom had a question, so he can go first.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Farhan, for that very interesting presentation. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, yeah, what are your thoughts on the current offerings via Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin? I don't know if you've had any chance to look at that or relative to the design experience, the whole experience itself, and any individual items or products, parts, artifacts, etc.
I haven't. I've haven't had a chance to see what they're offering in terms of design yet, but I have noticed some of the other companies like Vast's actually take into consideration of actually revisiting what the interior of a module looks like, or feels like, and how you interact with it. So it's exciting to see those things, and hopefully I can contribute to that. But I haven't had a chance to see what Blue Origin has been working on, apart from their race to be the best.
Okay, thank. I agree. I was at a vast conference about a week ago, and it was very impressive and very much design infused, or at least suggested that it was design infused, and it was quite a lovely presentation in all aspects.
Yeah, I think the one thing I do uh, appreciate and think is interesting to explore more is the fact that now that we have everyday, celebrities and people going up to space, like you start to think of what the interior is and how they interact with it and stuff. And it's interesting to see what Blue Origin has done too. So
Thank you.
Martina, you had a question about recording. Yes. So Michael, who's on this call, is recording each episode from now on. And the link to have access to all these episodes in the beginning, I'm just going to copy paste again. It's a YouTube channel that we just started for these OSMED member highlights. All right, Catherine, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thanks, Farhan, for presenting and Phnam for hosting. So I wanted to ask about, you mentioned empathy being like a component of your designs. And I think you kind of touched on it a little bit with the EpiPen design and the storytelling and, the experiences of the person that you worked with. Um, do you think you could talk a little bit more about empathy, how empathy has been, part of your process and maybe how you um, will incorporate it in any space designs? I just thought it was a really cool and interesting piece.
yeah, for sure. Uh, I'm trying to think of an example that's relevant to share, not under NDA, and hopefully different from what I've shared here. Um, I'll touch on the education side. So, um, basically, I worked with the Canada FASD Research Network, where we were developing an online training for frontline workers that support families that have kids affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So basically, this training was supposed to support them in delivering these services. Um, but being able to understand what their experience with current training methods was, being handed, like, binders upon binders and brochures and stuff like that to hand over to the families, it's not a great experience. And how can, like, I asked this question from the get-go, is like, how can I make that experience be more um user friendly and actually be adoptable, like something that they would want to actually use. And this eventually leads to more people joining that care force and frontline of providing these services. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Eric is one of the co-founder of OSMED. You raise your hand.
I think
Eric,
you're muted, Derek.
did he drop? I know he's here. Um, Eric, you muted. Is this a design or an engineering problem? The struggling to unmute.
I funny enough, I actually was when I was preparing that slide of failures. One of the things was actually Zoom, like the online meeting platforms, and how they tend to be like quite problematic when it comes to intuitive controls, especially Zoom.
Terrible. Absolutely the worst.
Like the most important tools are like hidden away in the more buttons.
Exactly, right? Um, it's funny. I don't know if all of you in this call, okay, Eric, come back. All of you in this call hang out with designers a lot, but it can be quite unpleasant to hang out with us because all we do all day is complain about how the world is designed and how badly everything is, um, how unintuitive everything is. Yeah, we need more design and less options when it comes to that.
Oh,
Can you
like,
hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Wow, I really didn't have a button for the microphone until I got back in.
We just talked about this
I'm like, I
while you were
was
gone.
there. So I want to touch on Catherine's part about empathy. And I want to talk about maybe a couple examples from the human space program over at NASA, where uh, I would say that I struggled with the lack of empathy for the people who are actually going and doing the jobs. Now, astronauts are absolutely very privileged people up to date. However, all that said, it was very common for me to hear from like NASA's leadership and especially NASA engineers that they're princesses. Oh, they want too much comfort. Oh, they need to suck it up more. And there were several places where this became an issue. One was in arguing about the requirements for how long you can leave somebody on their back on the top of a rocket in a suit before it becomes a problem, right? And around the temperature requirements for that, right? So, there's always these conversations about like, well, how hot can it get? And it's like, well, no, let's put you in the freaking oven and let's see how you like it, right? Because they're not the designers that are engineers that are doing this stuff. They lack the empathy for the person who's there, right? How much is it gonna hurt to be sitting there in these positions holding that? Another one, and I think the guy you were talking about was the designer for Skylab was the one who had actually put the window in, and that was a big fight. We have had fights at the highest levels of NASA about whether or not a Mars vehicle needs a window, right? The Marshall Smith, who was one of the older SE&I guys who's since left, was fighting tooth and nail against it because of the math and mass challenges that would actually involve. And
And we think a lot of these issues that you're bringing up, Eric, belong to the past, but these conversations are still happening today, and will
these are
happen in the
conversations that are
future.
very much happening today, right? Like none of the engineers want to put a window in anything. And this
Mhm.
happened during the Mercury program. This happened during Skylab. It is happening as parts of Artemis, and it's happening as we architect the Mars missions. Um, and what the engineers constantly ask for is hard evidence that it will behaviorally improve the astronauts' performance rather than, you know, these people are human. And what the hell would you want to do on a 3-year mission? Like, say you get to Mars and you can't even look out the window at it, right? They're like, oh, we can put it on a screen inside. It's like, that is not a very human experience. And so we also had an argument about whether or not Gateway was going to have a toilet, believe it or not. They wanted to rely on the Orion vehicle toilet, which was only certified for 21 days because of the way they did the process for Orion. Um, so, this is a ongoing invisible part of the work oftentimes that goes into spaceflight missions that are especially dominated by engineering groups. And they're dominated by engineering groups because in the past, the engineering challenge of getting there and staying there was the biggest challenge that we faced. And we're getting to the point where that's changing and where these commercial companies now have different responsibilities to their, I want to say, customers rather than astronauts, right? Because people are paying for this at this point. So uh, these are not things that are of the past. These are ongoing conversations where empathy is desperately needed for the people who are going to be in these positions and experiencing these things. I didn't really have a
I
question.
agree. Yeah, I agree. It almost made me think that the people that are actually doubting those things should maybe designers externally should create those environments for them to experience those stressors, just to have develop that empathy, put them in isolation, and I'm just joking.
And
Yeah.
some-
No,
and
I
sometimes
completely.
and sometimes you can't really force empathy on people who clearly don't have the tools to experience it, right? But that's why an organization like OSMED, who really puts forth the collaboration between different disciplines, we can't just have engineers make all the decisions. We can't have just business people make all the decisions. We can't have just scientists make all the decisions. Um, then you would end up with solutions that will serve no one. But what's beautiful about design is beyond the practice of design and the creation of designs. Our greatest skill is really to connect all of these disciplines together and to create a common language that makes it possible for all of us to do our best work.
I think one of the things you got to keep in mind is that as we're turning this corner in the industry, for designers to start learning about how and where they can plug in those requirements that force the engineers to actually consider these things, right? Level one, level two requirements in the system, standards that can be created that then become something that the engineers just naturally draw from, right? Those are ways that we can kind of improve the communication between the fields and try to sort of, let's say, design empathy into the systems.
Mhm.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with these beautiful words, something to look forward to, something to develop in the future within OSMED or in the space industry. I'm going to close this event. I would like to thank Farhan for being so generous with his time and with the work that he's doing, and can't wait to see what you do with the space industry and beyond. And I want to thank everybody for coming to this event. Some of you very regularly. Please bring friends next time, and for asking your questions. This is just the beginning of a long series of wonderful interviews with wonderful members of OSMED. And if you want to learn more about OSMED, go to osmed.org, and we may be able to answer all the questions you may have about how to make the future of human spaceflight safer and more inclusive of all. Thank you, everyone.